Hey there, I hope you're doing well. My name is Arya and today we're going to look at some more Reddit stories. If you enjoy Reddit stories, consider liking, subscribing, and maybe hitting that notification bell too. Let's get started with today's first story. Much love, everyone. Today's first story comes from my wife cheated after I said no to open marriage. I remember the day I first stepped onto the university campus. It felt like a big change from my small-town life in Benton, where the most exciting thing we did was attend church trips growing up in a religious home. I had never been far from my rural community. So the idea of going to a university filled with people from different backgrounds was both thrilling and scary. My parents were proud but nervous. When I got an agricultural scholarship to Taft University, they worried about me being exposed to new influences outside our close-knit rural community. And honestly, I had the same concerns. Who was that? Rena asked. Curiously, we were sitting in a cozy cafe and I was still processing the unexpected encounter. I met her intense gaze, her dark hair falling against her tan skin, and took a deep breath. That was Jasmine. I said softly. Rena looked confused at first, then recognition dawned. You're Jasmine? She asked, shocked. She and I were together a long time ago. I explained I haven't seen her in over 5 years. I didn't expect to run into her like that. I probably owe you the whole story. I admitted with a nod. Rena signaled she was ready to listen before attending Taft. The farthest I'd been from home was a week-long church trip to Mexico. My world was small, limited to other agricultural families near our town, and my upbringing was deeply rooted in religious values. My parents were cautiously happy when I got the scholarship, but I knew they worried about the college environment. At Taft, I shared a dorm with Charlie, a guy from Chicago at first. I think he was disappointed to have a country boy as his roommate, but we eventually became friends. My dorm mate's stories of sexual escapades shocked me. I'd only held hands and kissed my high school girlfriend. Their stories made me question whether people really did such things. Another surprise was that boys and girls lived in the same dorm, just on different floors. One day, while visiting a girl from my English class, I saw 2 girls leaving the show and only towels. They caught me staring and playfully teased me by flashing their towels. It left me embarrassed and flustered. My innocence quickly became a source of amusement for my dorm mates by junior year. I was still a maid, though I'd had a few experiences. I was torn between my religious upbringing and the temptations of college life. It was during this time that I met Jasmine. Charlie convinced me to go to a keg party. While I was standing in the crowd, a drunk guy bumped into me, causing me to spill my beer on a girl. Passed ing by the girl. Jasmine looked annoyed and I tried to wipe the beer off her shoulder. But when I hesitated before touching her chest, she laughed and introduced herself. We spent the rest of the party together. Jasmine was a sophomore studying business, living in an apartment her family owned. She was attractive with blonde hair and a flirty smile that immediately caught my attention. That night marked the start of something new for me. At the end of the night, Jasmine asked me to walk her home. She lived in an apartment above a restaurant called Papaya located near campus. The building owned by her brother also had a coffee shop, bar, pizza place, and phone store on the lower level. Her apartment was on the top floor and, as we climbed the stairs, she mentioned she didn't have a roommate, which made me a little nervous once inside. I hesitated at the door, but Jasmine pulled me and we sat on the couch, and after a bit of conversation I leaned in and kissed her. She responded enthusiastically, but then broke away, saying she'd be right back. When she returned, she was unclothed, wearing only a strip. She joked about washing her beer-stained clothes, but clearly had other things in mind. Things quickly escalated and, despite my moral upbringing, I gave in temptation. However, in my excitement I finished before we even began. Jasmine didn't seem to mind and calmly cleaned up the mess afterward. We had sex and I lost my pureness as I lay there. My mind raced, wondering about the morality of my actions, what this meant for us, and whether it was just a one-night stand. Jasmine, however, seemed content snuggling up to me when she went to the bathroom. I began to leave, but she insisted I stay, so I did. We started seeing each other regularly. I spent most of my time at her place since I shared an apartment with 3 other guys. The more time we spent together, the more I grew to care for her. Those ex became a central part of our relationship. We also went out to restaurants, studied together, and did normal couple activities. One evening I explained to my roommates that I was seeing Jasmine, and when Charlie found out who she was, he cautioned me. He warned that feelings and Z could get mixed up, especially with a first serious girlfriend, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Eventually, I met Jasmine's brother Claude at Papaya. He was a big, intimidating guy, quite different from Jasmine physically. He was friendly, but had a rough edge, and his associate Armin didn't seem trustworthy. Later, Jasmine told me her brother had some legal issues and was very protective of her. Despite that, I appreciated that he looked out for her as our relationship deepened. I realized Jasmine and I came from very different worlds. I had strong morals shaped by my disciplined upbringing, while she had a more chaotic background with no steady father figure. Despite these differences, we got along well, although sometimes her anger would flare up in unsettling ways, such as road rage or arguments. These moments bothered me, but they passed quickly by summer. I interned with the university's agricultural department while Jazz stayed at her apartment and worked at Papaya. I often visited her at the bar, observing the rough crowd that frequented the place. Though Claude was always friendly to me, something about him and his associate Armin made me uncomfortable. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't seeing the full picture with Jasmine's family. What bothered me was how some of the customers acted around Jasmine, putting an arm around her, patting her, or hugging too closely. It felt too familiar for someone in a relationship when I brought it up. Let us know if you're excited about this story. Press A if you liked the video. Press B if not. Your comments really push me to find more stories that are positive and have meaning. She shrugged it off, saying that's just how it is working in a bar, her casual attitude about something I considered sacred. Her physical space was concerning, and I knew we'd have to talk about it. Eventually, another issue was missing: the study abroad deadline. I had been so wrapped up in my relationship with Jasmine that I lost focus on applying. I tried to rationalize it as a necessary sacrifice for a relationship, but I regretted not pursuing the opportunity. As my senior year began, Jasmine and I were still comfortable together, but I noticed she wasn't taking her studies seriously. Meanwhile, my senior year was packed with classes and research. Jasmine had met my family on a summer trip, and the contrast between her flashy style and my family's simple, practical lifestyle was stark. My family welcomed her, and though our backgrounds were different, I think Jasmine appreciated some of the simplicity of farm life. Despite this, I felt like I was trying to save her from her more spontaneous lifestyle. While she was opening me up to a more exciting world, our Z life continued to thrive, often serving as a way to resolve disagreements without addressing the underlying issues. It was exciting, but ultimately left problems unresolved during winter break. I went home and my father had a heart-to-heart with me. He gently reminded me of our family's values, hinting that if I was serious enough to be physically engaged with Jasmine, I should consider marriage. His words stuck with me, and I began thinking about my future with Jasmine. As the winter term started, I was offered a postgraduate research position at the university, which would keep me rooted there. I began to realize how much Jasmine meant to me, and I decided I wanted to marry her. Despite our differences, I believed we could overcome them together. A few weeks later, over dinner, I proposed to Jasmine. She seemed surprised but accepted, albeit with a casual "sure, why not?" Her reaction wasn't as emotional as I had expected, but I was happy she said yes. In the months leading up to the wedding, we dealt with blending our very different family. My humble religious family contrasted sharply with her more free-spirited party-loving relatives. The wedding ceremony took place in a church, but the reception was held at Papaya, symbolizing the clash of our two worlds. Despite this, everything went smoothly at the reception. Jasmine's brother Claude offered his congratulations but added a veiled warning to take care of her, hinting at his protective, almost threatening nature. though I appreciated his care for her. I still felt uneasy around him at first. Married life wasn't much different from before. We still lived in Jasmine's apartment above Papaya, and I focused on saving for a house. I expected things to feel different after the wedding, but they didn't, at least for a while. I pushed Jasmine to re-enroll in school, though she wasn't excited about it. I also tried to introduce small changes like studying, more drinking, less, and even going to church. Initially she went along with it jokingly, calling me dad, but eventually these reminders felt more like nagging. I also started resenting her time spent at Papaya, both working and hanging out. The bar had a wild atmosphere, and I was uncomfortable with how some customers acted too familiar with her. It became a growing point of tension between us around the same time. My job was going well, my research on hybrid crops was progressing, but I needed to spend more time at a college farm about 3 hours away. I told Jasmine I'd be gone for a few days every other week and invited her to join me when she could. She wasn't enthusiastic, and during my first trip I threw myself into work, hardly noticing the lack of comfort at the farmhouse. When I returned excited to share my progress, I found Jasmine at Papaya talking to Dennis, one of the bartenders. I asked her to come with me on my next trip to the farm, and though she reluctantly agreed, the visit turned out to be a disaster. She quickly got bored and I snapped at her, leading to tension between us on the drive home. I apologized and we seemed to smooth things over, but it felt like our connection was slipping the next time I went to the farm. I tried to stay in touch, but Jasmine didn't answer my calls when I finally reached her. She sounded hungover, which frustrated me. By the time I got home, things were tense and neither of us could shake the bad mood. I tried to fix things, bringing her gifts and being more attentive, but something still felt off. One day, I realized Jasmine seemed bored with our marriage. I thought about it during my next trip to the farm and came up with a plan. A second honeymoon in Cancun to rekindle our relationship, excited to surprise her. I returned home early when I couldn't find Jasmine in the apartment. I went to Papaya, where I spotted her sitting on another man's lap, arms around his neck, laughing. The sight hit me hard. I walked up behind Jasmine while she sat on Jerome's lap. Jerome, the tattooed guy, looked at me and said, "Help you?" I didn't respond. When Jasmine turned around, her smile disappeared. She jumped up and stammered, "Owen. I thought you wouldn't be home until later." "Obviously," I said, turning to leave. "Owen, wait, please," she called after me. "This is just my friend Jerome." I kept walking, but she caught up and grabbed my arm. I yanked it away, causing her to stumble. At that moment, her brother Claude appeared and grabbed me by the arms. "What's going on?" Claude asked angrily. "It's none of your business," I replied, trying to free myself, but his grip was tight. "It looked like you knocked my sister down," he said, "which makes it my business." Jasmine quickly intervened, saying, "It's okay, Claude. Owen didn't mean it." Claude released me, patted my back with a forked smile, and said, "Just making sure my sister was okay." Jasmine urged me to go upstairs. As we climbed the stairs, my mind raced with thoughts of her laughing on Jerome's lap and the threat I felt from Claude. Our conversation about the incident went nowhere. She insisted Jerome was just a friend, while I felt her behavior was inappropriate for a married woman. For weeks things were tense between us, and for the first time I questioned whether our marriage had been a mistake. Despite this, Jasmine seemed to be trying harder. She was more affectionate and showed more interest in my life, but I sensed it wasn't entirely genuine. Meanwhile, Jerome was always around, smoking in the alley near Papaya. His smirk every time I passed made me uncomfortable, and I began to dread my work trips to the farm, worried about what might be happening while I was away. One Friday, I came home and found the windows open in our apartment. Even though it was cold outside, I brushed it off, but later, while putting my bag under the bed, I found a stub of a thin black cigar, just like the ones Jerome smoked. I realized he had likely been in our apartment. While I was gone that night at dinner, I casually asked Jasmine why the windows had been open. She tensed up and stammered that she had been hot. Her nervous response made it clear she was hiding something. While I stayed calm, I knew I needed to take action. The next day I contacted a private investigator named Paul Gamble. We met and I explained the situation he suggested, placing wireless cameras in the apartment. While I was away after coordinating Jasmine's schedule, we planned to install the cameras when she wouldn't be home that Thursday. Paul and I set up the cameras, one in the main room, one in the bathroom and one in the bedroom. Paul assured me they would only activate when there was movement and that he'd start recording the next time I went to the farm as I prepared to leave again. I tried to act normal around Jasmine, but the weight of my suspicions grew heavier. I couldn't stop thinking about Jerome and the likelihood that something was happening behind my back. I knew the cameras would reveal the truth, but the thought of what they might capture filled me with dread. The following Wednesday I left for Blackstock full of anxiety, praying Paul's cameras wouldn't reveal anything and hoping my marriage could survive. I fantasized about a fresh start with Jasmine, maybe moving to a new house and raising a family, but the memory of the cigar kept bringing me back to reality. My calls with Jasmine were short and I fought the urge to contact Paul for updates on Friday. I finally reached out, but only got his voicemail later. I received a text out of town until Sunday, let's meet Monday. I felt both relieved and anxious. Postponing any bad news for a few more days. That weekend was tense. I was distracted and distant, which Jasmine noticed. She asked if I was okay and I brushed it off, claiming everything was fine, but I knew I couldn't keep up the act much longer. On Monday, I met Paul at the coffee shop. His expression gave nothing away, but he pushed a folder across the table toward me. Owen, it's not good. He said there are photos and videos, but this will tell you enough. I opened the folder with trembling hands. The photos show Jasmine and Jerome in closeness, compromising positions in our apartment, evidence of her infidelity. I was stunned, overcome with a mix of anger, sadness, and self-loathing. Paul, noticing my reaction, calmly advised, "Don't do anything rash. You need to think about your next steps carefully." He was right, violence wasn't the answer. I thanked him and asked for a lawyer recommendation. He handed me a note with John Scalia's name and number. I realized I couldn't stay with Jasmine. Even if I forgave her, I'd never trust her again. Divorce was the only option. I left the coffee shop determined to move on. Later, I visited the university to explore a research exchange program abroad. I told my supervisor Tim Kerwin that I wanted to leave the area as soon as possible. He hesitated but offered me a spot at a rural research post in Indonesia, which I immediately accepted. After returning home, I contacted the lawyer John Scalia and scheduled a meeting. I provided him with the evidence of Jasmine's affair and he explained how the divorce process would work. We discussed dividing our minimal assets and I told him I wanted the divorce papers served the next day, while I'd be away at the farm, avoiding confrontation with Jasmine. I spent the following day preparing for my new life. I met with Tim to finalize the overseas assignment and learned I'd first fly to Los Angeles, then Jakarta and finally, to a rural village nearby. Tim gave me the details, including necessary vaccinations, and I prepared for the next chapter in my life, ready to leave the mess of my marriage behind. Suddenly everything was in motion. I had one last night in the apartment with Jasmine, but I wanted to avoid confrontation. My plan was simple: leave early in the morning, like I was heading to the farm. I get my vaccinations, swing by the apartment, to grab my things and head to Benton. My flight to Indonesia was Saturday and I'd stay at an airport motel Friday night. By Saturday morning, my new life would begin at the clinic. I got several shots, a bunch of pills and pamphlets on tropical diseases. I returned to the apartment, parked away from the building to avoid running into Claude or Jasmine, and quickly packed the rest of my things. My phone kept buzzing with calls and texts from Jasmine. It hit me that she had been served the divorce papers. I hadn't told the lawyer to delay serving her, and now I had to leave fast. As I headed down the alley toward my car, Claude appeared, blocking my path. He confronted me about Jasmine, accusing me of avoiding her calls. I tried to brush him off, but he shoved me and demanded I stay to talk it out. When I tried to slip past him, he knocked me down and in his rage started striking me. I managed to shout for help and 2 passers-by intervened, causing Claude to leave, shaken and bruised. I got help from the bystanders to reach my car after driving out of the city. Relief and fear hit me all at once. I had escaped, but I knew I couldn't stay around any longer. I needed to start over. A few days later, I was at the airport ready for my flight to Indonesia. My lawyer had emailed me confirming Jasmine had been served and there was no contact from her. Yet, as I boarded the plane, I felt a sense of closure for the first time in months. I wasn't thinking about Jasmine arriving in Indonesia. I was welcomed by the Effendi family, who grew coffee and cocoa. My living quarters were simple and the work was hard, but I found satisfaction in the routine. One evening I watched the Effendi brothers practice, eyeing Selit, a martial art curious. I asked them to teach me, though hesitant at first. They agreed, warning it would be painful. The training was tough, but I was determined to learn how to defend myself. As I settled into my new life, I also formed a bond with a farmer named Baki and his family. His daughter Rina, a nurse in her 20s, caught my attention, though her family kept a close watch. I found myself drawn to her warmth and kindness, and I began to appreciate the possibility of a future beyond the pain of my past. One Friday evening, Baki and I were having some local beer. When I worked up the nerve to ask Baki, would it be okay if I took Rina out for dinner sometime, just the two of us, he sighed and looked into the distance for a while. Before replying, I, like you, Owen, but I have to protect my family. Then he shared the tragic story of how Rina's mother and father were eliminated by rebels almost 10 years ago. It explained the pain in his eyes and why he was so protective. I would never hurt Rina, I assured him. He studied me for a moment before clasping my arm. I believe you. A few weeks later, Rina and I were officially dating, going out without chaperone. One night Bhakti and I sat drinking again, and I asked what happened to the rebels. He explained that revenge, or Mimi's dendam, was part of their culture. They waited, found the rebels, and punished them. This shocked me as it clashed with my upbringing. Still, I understood Bhakti's actions and didn't blame him. Suddenly Bhakti changed the subject and asked, "When are you going to marry my niece?" He laughed, but it was something I had been thinking about. I had been with Rina for 6 months and I knew I wanted to marry her. My first marriage had taught me the difference between lust and love, and with Rina, I knew it was real. Around the same time, I received an email from my lawyer, John Scalia, informing me that my divorce from Jasmine was final. With that chapter officially closed, I felt free to move forward with my life. Physically, I had changed too. I was stronger and more confident thanks to my workouts with the Effendi brothers, who had taught me cut. I also took my time with Rina, wanting to respect her family and our relationship. Although we hadn't been physically engaged, yet the attraction between us was undeniable. When I thought about marriage, I knew I wanted my family to meet Rina, so we planned a trip to the US during our visit. Rina won over my parents with her warmth and sincerity. We also visited my old university, and my advisor Tim suggested I pursue a master's degree while continuing my research. Before we flew back to Indonesia, Rina and I spent the night alone for the first time at an airport hotel. She was nervous, but after a heartfelt conversation, we became physically engaged, and afterward, she surprised me by saying, "Yes, I will marry you." I was thrilled and realized I had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Back in Indonesia, I formally asked Bhakti for permission to marry Rina, and he, along with the rest of her family, was overjoyed. My family was happy too, although they were nervous about traveling to Indonesia for the wedding. I left most of the wedding planning to Rina and her family, while I focused on my work in starting my master's degree in agricultural science. During the pre-wedding period, I spent more time with Rina's younger sister Nephi at 16. She resembled a younger Rina but was more sheltered due to the family's traumatic past. Despite her innocence, she was smart and kind-hearted, and I enjoyed her company. One day, Nephi nervously asked, "Are you and Rina moving to America?" I reassured her, saying, "No matter where we live, there will always be a place for you." Her worried expression softened and she smiled, relieved by my answer. Nephi's innocence made me protective, knowing Rina and I would need to help guide her when the wedding day came. My family, including my parents, traveled to Indonesia. The ceremony was simple, but joyful, and I was glad my family had the chance to bond with Rinas. At one point my dad pulled me aside, told me, "You picked the right one this time." His words meant a lot given how my first marriage ended. After the wedding, life settled into a new routine. Rina and I lived in a small house on box property. It was simple, but we were close to her family and I continued my work and studies. We also spent time with Nephi, whose sweetness always brightened our days as the months passed. I realized I'd been in Indonesia for nearly 4 years. One day I received an email from Tim Kerwin at Taft University about a professorship opening I had completed. My master's, and Tim encouraged me to apply. I discussed it with Rina, who was excited, but also hesitant about leaving her family. After talking with Bhakti, who encouraged her to embrace the opportunity, we decided to make the move to America. Soon after, I was offered the job and had 4 weeks to wrap up our life in Indonesia. Saying goodbye to Bhakti's 6 call, and especially Nephi, was difficult. The night before we left, Nephi reminded me of my promise that she would always have a place with us, and I reassured her that she would visit us in America with the money I had saved over my years in Indonesia. Rina and I were able to buy a house near Taft University. Rina also found work at the campus health clinic, though she needed a few more classes to become a registered nurse. We settled into life in the US quickly, but Rina missed her family deeply, especially in those early months. One Saturday evening, while we were out at a restaurant, I suddenly heard a familiar voice behind me. It was Jasmine, my ex-wife. She greeted me with fake friendliness, commenting on how I looked and turning her attention to Rina with rude racist remarks. Rina, always gracious, introduced herself, but Jasmine ignored her and continued her taunts. The restaurant manager finally stepped in and escorted Jasmine out. Afterward, Rina sat in shock, trying to reconcile what she knew of me with my past. I explained that Jasmine and I had a messy history, and that's why I hadn't talked about her much. "I hope we never see her again," I said, and Rina nodded in understanding, though still shaken by the encounter. Jasmine's long-bottled anger over Owen leaving her years ago finally exploded. She didn't care what the lawyers said. He was still her husband. Seeing him with that Chinese chick in her town had humiliated her, and she was furious, determined to get revenge. She went to Papaya to talk to Claude, hoping he could help. Claude was at his usual table with Armin and some regulars. Jasmine marched up and told him what had happened at the restaurant with Owen and the woman, and there he was acting like he was better than me with that girl. She finished angrily. Claude drummed his fingers, thinking honestly he felt she was better off without Owen. "So who was the girl?" he asked. "I don't know, I only saw them for a minute." Jasmine nearly yelled. "Calm down. Tell me what she looked like," Claude said. Jasmine described the woman as best as she could remember. "I think her name was Rita or something like that." Claude called over Dennis, the bartender, and asked him to keep an eye out for Owen around campus. A few days later, Claude found out Owen was now a professor at the college and married to a woman named Rina who worked as a nurse. Claude thought about it and smiled, remembering how he had knocking Owen before. Maybe it was time for another round, and if the wife was as attractive as he heard, maybe he could have some fun too. Later that week, I came home to find Rina upset. She had spoken with Nephi, who was heartbroken about being apart from her. Nephi, now 19 and finished with school, missed her sister terribly. Rina was concerned about Nay's innocence and wondered if she'd be okay in the US. I reassured her, saying we'd take care of Nephi and look into getting her enrolled at Taft. We began planning for her arrival. One Wednesday, Rina rode her bike to work, and when I got home later, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, visibly shaken. She explained that a man in a black vehicle had blocked her path, asked her intrusive questions, and wouldn't let her pass. What scared her most was that he called her by name, even though she hadn't told him. I immediately realized it was Claude. Later, Claude bragged to Jasmine about scaring Rina. Jasmine, unimpressed, urged him to do more to knock Owen up again, but this time with her there to watch. Claude agreed, smiling, and began planning. That Saturday, Rina and I went to the park to play tennis. Partway through our game, I noticed Jasmine and Claude entering our court. They claimed they were just watching, but their presence made Rina nervous, especially when she recognized Claude. as the man who had maltreated at her on her bike. Claude soon suggested playing doubles, and though I hesitated, I agreed to stand up to him as we started playing. I noticed Claude standing too close to Rena, his arm around her under the pretense of giving a tennis lesson, enraged. I told him to back off, but, as I approached, Claude turned and threw a punch. My SEAT training helped me dodge the worst of it, but the blow still knocked me down. I sat on the ground stunned, while Claude loomed over me with a smug, vicious smile. Claude's punch took me back to the knocking in the alley years ago. I had promised myself that no one would ever punch me like that again, especially not in front of my wife. I scrambled to my feet quickly, surprising Claude. He didn't have time to continue the attack. Like last time. "You ready to get your bum kicked again?" He taunted. Things had changed since our last fight. I had gained 30 pounds of muscle, and I knew how to fight thanks to Vickle and the offending Claude. On the other hand, had put on weight in his gut. I raised my hands in a defense stance. "Ready? Want to try again, a holy?" I said. Claude rushed at me, relying on brute strength. I quickly pushed him back, causing him to stumble, his smirk fading. "Surprised, punk?" I taunted. He wasn't facing the same guy from years ago. As he came closer, I bent low and delivered a solid sidekick, making him wince in pain. "Owen, stop!" Rena pleaded, distracting me. Claude used the moment to lunge at me. I quickly closed in and struck him with an elbow to the head, knocking him to his knees. I paused, knowing he was done. "Okay, Claude, we're even, Leighton." "Forget this." I said. "Screw you, we're just starting," he snarled, struggling for breath. I turned to leave with Rena, but she warned me Claude was coming at me again. I grabbed his wrist, twisted it, and threw him to the ground. A few strikes later, it was clear he was finished. Before leaving, I kicked him in the face for good measure. Then shot Jasmine. A smirk. We walked past a stunned Jasmine. Her image of me completely changed in the following weeks. We saw no sign of Claude or Jasmine. Life returned to normal, but Rena was more cautious, rarely riding her bike to school. We focused on preparing for Nay's arrival. She was excited to start her new life in America, and while Bhakti was happy for her, there was a hint of sadness in his words when we picked up Nephi at the airport. She was emotional, excited, but overwhelmed. She was quiet during the ride home, soaking in the new environment. When Rena showed her the guest room we had prepared, Nephi burst into tears, asking, "Is this really mine?" Rena smiled and nodded. Over the next week we showed Nephi around, getting her settled before she started summer classes. Nephi adapted well, but we had to break her of her new obsession with American daytime TV. One concern lingered. Nephi was beautiful, innocent, and trusting, making her vulnerable. I warned Rena that she needed to talk to her sister about the average American male. Soon after, Nephi mentioned a guy named Brandon, who invited her to a concert. She was excited, but I was worried when she went out with him. I couldn't sleep, and then, in the middle of the night, Rena got a call. We picked up Nafi from a mini-mart, clearly upset, but Rena asked me not to press her with questions. The next day, Rena talked to her privately and later told me what happened. The date started fine, but after the concert, Brandon pressured Nephi for non-classic sex and later tried again for a hand job. Nephi refused both times and called Rena to pick her up. It was exactly what I had feared, innocent Nei encountering the wrong kind of guy. "What are we going to do?" I asked Rena. "Nothing. This is part of life for women. Men want our bodies and we have to be careful who we give it to," she explained. "Does that mean I hesitated?" "You went through this before me?" "That's not your business," she said, smiling, "but from now on, my body is only for you." She pressed against me, her words reassuring, yet leaving me with lingering thoughts. I wasn't completely satisfied with Rena's answer, but I decided not to push the subject. The rest of the summer was calm. Nephi didn't seem affected by her date with Brandon, and we never heard from him again. We spent time showing Nephi around, and we even took a trip to Benton where she got reacquainted with my family. Nephi seemed to enjoy America and everything felt fine as we prepared for the fall term. Claude was still furious. He couldn't believe I'd striken him and he wanted revenge. He just wasn't sure how or when Jasmine kept complaining about how I had left after her conveniently ignoring her own infidelity. Claude knew he needed to find a way to get back at me, but he didn't want to get caught and end up in jail again. He decided to get some of his sources to keep an eye on things. Fall term started and I had a full load of classes. Rena had become a registered nurse and was working full-time at the campus clinic. She had her driver's license and we bought her a used car. Nephi was also taking a full course load. We occasionally saw her on campus, but there was no further mention of Brandon. Rena told me that she and Nephi had discussed dating and that Nephi was young and would have her own experiences. I agreed, but still worried as Nephi had led a sheltered life. The focus of our conversations was mostly on school and classes. Nephi didn't mention any dates or boyfriends, though one day I spotted her at the coffee shop with a couple of people, but I couldn't tell who they were a week later. Rena set the table for two and I asked, "Isn't Nephi eating with us tonight?" She called. Rena said she's out with friends and getting dinner in town. Is this a date? I asked. Oh, she's just making friends, Rena said with a smile at some point. Sheck have a boyfriend and it'll be fine. I knew she was right, but I still worried. Nephi was so innocent and I didn't want her to get hurt over the next few weeks. Nephi spent more time with her new friends and Rena reassured me that they were good people. Then Rena mentioned that Nephi had a dinner date with one of the guys from her group, an older student. When the guy came to pick Nephi up, I was surprised to see it was Dennis. Libby, the bartender from Papaya. Alarm bells went off in my head. Someone connected to Claude and Jasmine was now dating Nephi. Nice to see you, Owen, Dennis said, shaking my hand. I knew I needed to talk to him privately, but didn't want to embarrass Nephi while she was finishing getting ready. I asked Dennis to see the garden once outside. I told him I was concerned about his connection to Claude and Jasmine. Dennis assured me that he had little contact with them anymore, mostly working in the coffee shop, not the bar. I felt somewhat reassured, but still warned him to be careful with Nephi. He promised he would as time went on. Nephi and Dennis spent more time together. They didn't sleep over at each other's places, but Nephi occasionally got home late. Things seemed to be going well and I relaxed a little, thinking that maybe I didn't need to worry about Dennis. After all, meanwhile, Claude was plotting one day. A Papaya employee excitedly told him that he had seen Rena at the coffee shop with Dennis. Claude became suspicious and asked Armin to put someone eyable on Dennis to keep an eye on him as fall progressed. Napi and Dennis grew closer. We often ate meals together and things seemed normal. Life had returned to routine and I was starting to believe we were done with Claude and Jasmine for good, but Claude wasn't done. After some surveillance, Armin reported that Dennis was dating Nephi. Not Rena. Claude saw this as his opening to get to me through Nephi. He began planning. One afternoon, Nephi told Rena she would meet Dennis for dinner after her classes. She planned to study at the library, then meet him at the coffee shop when he finished work. Little did we know Claude was watching and waiting as Nephi walked. She reflected on how happy she was with her new life in America, attending college, having a great relationship with Dennis, living with her sister and being surrounded by friendly people. You got the stuff? Claude asked. Armin, working behind the bar, nodded. He glanced at the small white bowl filled with crushed tablets. Ruiz. He knew just how much to use, knew enough to make the sufferer groggy, but not fully unconscious. He'd done this before. Just then Claude's phone rang. After listening, he hung up. Is she coming? Jasmine whispered from her spot at the bar. She was told to head upstairs to avoid raising Dennis's suspicions. Yeah, Claude replied. Now get lost. Jasmine followed orders and went up the back stairs to Claude's office. Nephi arrived at the coffee shop, where a large American man held the door open for her. Thank you, she said with a smile as they entered. Dennis was behind the counter closing for the night. Hey Dennis, the large man called out, engaging him in friendly conversation. Let me buy you a drink. Dennis hesitated, looking at Nephi, who nodded, finding the man friendly. They followed Claude to the bar behind the coffee shop. Leighton, sit at the bar, Claude suggested, clapping Dennis on the back. Claude ordered 3 Ipas Uring, the bitter taste would mask the pill's flavor they all toasted and drank. If I noticed the beer was stronger than she was used to soon, Nephi began slurring her words and Dennis looked confused and alarmed within minutes. Nephi was slumping in her seat, Claude decided. It was time to get them out of sight. Need the bathroom, he quietly asked. Nephi, who nodded weakly with Armin's help, Claude led them upstairs to his office, where both Nephi and Dennis were barely conscious as they placed the two on the bed. Jasmine reappeared. I'll look after Dennis, she said, make sure to keep an eye on her. Meanwhile, at home I arrived to find Rena in the kitchen. Is Nephi joining us tonight? I asked. No, she's out with Dennis. Rena replied later that night. Rena grew concerned when Nephi didn't answer her calls. I haven't heard from her or Dennis, Rena said, worry creeping into her voice around midnight. Still no word from Nephi. I suggested we wait another hour before I'd go check Dennis's apartment, but no one answered when I knocked and his place looked empty. I searched the town for Dennis's car, but found nothing by 2 a.m. I was parked outside Dennis's apartment waiting by 5 a.m. I was heading home when I spotted a figure slumped on the curb near our house. As I got closer, I realized it was Nephi, undressed, dirty and disheveled. She was breathing but clearly traumatized. Nephi. I shook her gently. She screamed and flailed, terrified, before recognizing me. I wrapped her in my coat and she broke down in tears. I quickly called REA and we brought her home. Nephi, still in shock, insisted on taking a shower. Rena tried to come comfort her, but Nephi kept repeating, I don't know. Rena stayed with Nephi, who was inconsolable while I waited in the kitchen. When Rena came out, she said she's too upset to talk, but it seems like she was pilled. Tears streamed down her face. As I hugged her suddenly, a thought hit me. Where's Dennis? I got back in the car and drove to Dennis's apartment. It looked just as it had earlier, empty and quiet. I called Dennis, and after a few rings he finally answered with a raspy voice. Where are you? I demanded, anger boiling inside me. There was a long pause. I'm not sure. Who is this? It's Owen, I shouted. Where's Nephi? What happened last night? Dennis sounded confused and disoriented, but we arranged to meet at his apartment when he arrived. He looked terrible, dazed like Nephi had been, but at least he was dressed. I had little sympathy for him. He had put Nephi in danger, and I needed answers. Dennis explained that after meeting Nephi, Claude showed up and invited them for a drink at Papaya. The next thing he remembered was waking up in a parking garage. He had no idea what happened after they drank with Claude sitting there in his dark apartment. I realized Claude had lured them both to Papaya, likely pilled them, and something terrible had happened to Nephi. My anger at Dennis shifted toward Claude and Jasmine. Dennis asked if he could see Nephi, but I firmly said no and left when I got home. Rena told me that Nephi had a similar story to Dennis's. Rena suspected they had been pilled, describing symptoms consistent with a data attack pill. My heart sank as I asked the question I dreaded. Does Nephi think anything sexual happened? Rena, with tears streaming down her face, told me Nephi couldn't remember but had mild bruising. That indicated something had happened. She added that Nephi needed to go to the hospital for tests, and the morning after pill, the police would likely be involved. After that I felt overwhelming guilt. I had promised to protect Nephi, and now this had happened on my watch after Rena and Nephi went to the hospital. I stayed home waiting anxiously. The police took Nay's statement, but without DNA evidence or solid memories, the investigation was limited. Later, I overheard Rena speaking with her family in Indonesia. She told me that Bhakti and Vile were coming to support Nephi and that they planned to take her home. That hit me hard. My emotions boiled over, and without saying anything to REA, I grabbed my keys and drove to Papaya. I entered the bar determined to confront Claude. I found him sitting with Armin at their usual booth. I demanded to know what they had done to Nephi. Claude played dumb, smiling as he mocked me. My anger intensified and I grabbed a beer bottle ready to attack, but Armin casually revealed a pistol hidden under a newspaper, freezing me in my tracks. Claude calmly told me, It was time to leave and, as I walked away, he called out with a sneer. "Tell Neffy hello from us, she sure is fun." I left filled with rage when I got home. I found Nephi resting and Rena quiet, watching over her. Later Rena told me that Bhakti and Vile would be arriving soon and I worried about what they would think. If they'd see me as a failure for not protecting, Neffy was recovering slowly but surely. We'd kept Dennis away for now, though, he kept calling it was Bhakti and Vi's first time in America. So, for a few days we played the role of tourists showing them around, like it was just a normal visit, but on the third night, Bhakti asked me to take a walk. I knew this conversation was coming and in a way I welcomed it. Owen. He began softly. "Why aren't these men in jail?" I tried to explain the justice system, evidence innocent until proven guilty, but even I struggled to make sense of it. Bhakti listened in silence, head down, hands clasped behind his back, taking it all in. "So the police can't help?" he asked. I shook my head after a long pause. He said these men must pay. I nodded in agreement. We walked quietly until Bhakti finally spoke again. "Do you believe Dennis will help us?" "I do." I replied. "Good, have Dennis come tomorrow." "I have a plan," he said confidently. "What's the plan?" I asked, feeling a mix of curiosity and unease. "You remember how we tricked the rebels, lured them back to Punto promising more young girls, but only men were waiting for them. We handled the problem." He explained, his voice steady as we reached the house. He clasped my shoulder and said in his language, "Mimel is dined revenge." The next day, Rena and Nephi left to shop, giving us time to plot. Bhakti laid out the plan, a trap for Claude and his crew. It seemed risky, but Bhakti was confident. Dennis's involvement was key and he was eager to make things right. After what had happened, Nephi, Vile and I leave in 3 days. We'll wait for everything to unfold. Bhakti said. Dennis went to Papaya playing the role Bhakti had coached him on. He approached Claude pretending everything was normal. Claude was cautious at first but warmed up when Dennis mentioned Nephi. "I've been with Nephi, she's been begging for more," Dennis said. Forcing a smile, Claude's interest was piqued. He even hinted at wanting to see Nephi again. Dennis kept his cool, sticking to the script. Later, Dennis reported back to us. "Claude bought it, he's interested in Nephi and thinks she wants to see him again." With that we moved to the next phase, sending texts from Nephi. Rena and Vile helped craft the messages, and we used pictures of Nephi and Rena to keep Claude hooked. The fake flirtation worked, stoking Claude's ego and desire. Eventually, we sent a message telling Claude that Nephi's uncle would be away and inviting him to visit. Claude was tempted, imagining a trip similar to one he had taken to Thailand, but this time with an amateur like Nephi. He asked if he could bring friends and we played along, sending more pictures of supposed friends, actually paid photos of women from Jakarta. The trap was set, Rena handled our trap arrangements and soon we were on a plane to Indonesia. The familiar sights and sounds of Bima brought back memories, but I couldn't afford nostalgia now. We had a mission: revenge. We stayed with the Fuses and the reunion was bittersweet. Nephi was staying with the Offends for now. As I hugged her goodbye, I whispered, "I'm sorry." Tears filled her eyes. "I just don't want to be afraid anymore," she said, breaking my heart, but that sorrow quickly reignited my anger. "I'll take care of her, aka," the older Effendi brother promised. As he drove her away, the messages between Nephi and Claude continued, with Rena and Vile carefully crafting them to keep Claude hooked. The morning of their arrival, we transformed the fuzzy house into a trap. Rena pretending to be Nephi was the bait. It was the part of the plan that made me the most anxious, sensing my nerves. Bhakti reassured me, pressing his forehead to mine. "Owen, trust the plan. No one from our family will be hurt." Rena would be undressed to distract Claude and the others when they arrived, making them believe she was Nephi from a distance. Despite the awkwardness, Rena was committed to the plan. We waited. Bhakti and I were hiding in an outbuilding, while Vile was inside ready to signal us when they arrived. Finally, the message came: they're on their way. My nerves kicked in as we saw a vehicle approaching. Rena, posing as Nephi, stepped onto the porch undressed and called out hi before disappearing inside. Claude and Armin eagerly rushed toward the house. Jasmine, trailing behind, suddenly sensed something was wrong. "Claude," she screamed, "it's a trap." Chaos erupted inside. Vile was struggling with Armin. Jasmine clawed at me in a fit of rage, but I held back from slapping her outside. Claude tried to escape, but Bhakti, with swift martial arts skills, took him down, pinning him with ease. Claude screamed threats, but Bhakti held him calmly. By call subdued Armin, then secured Jasmine, who was still lashing out at me with Claude knocked unconscious. We tied all three of them up inside the house, waiting for nightfall. When it was time, we prepared to move them. Bhakti removed their gags briefly to ask why they had hurt Nephi. Claude, defiant, claimed Nephi enjoyed it. Furious, Bhakti ordered the gags back on. We transported them in a van bound and gagged to a remote harbor. Bhakti had arranged a boat with his cousin. The boat ride, reeking of diesel and fish, took us to a remote island. As we neared the shore, we removed the gags and Jasmine tried to plead with me, but I ignored her. Once on the island, we loaded them onto a truck, covering them with burlap to avoid suspicion as we journeyed deeper into the jungle. After hours of rough travel, we arrived in a clearing and stripped them of their clothes, leaving them undressed and vulnerable as they begged for answers. Bhakti calmly explained, "You left my niece like this. Now it's your turn." He tossed them a rusty knife and left them tied up, just as they had done to Nephi. As we drove away, Bhakti added one final thought, "EY for an eye, tooth, a tooth." We left them on Dragon Island to fend for themselves. As we prepared to drive away, Claude shouted again, desperate. "What is Dragon Island? Where are we? You're on Kodo Island B," Call replied coolly, "home of the Kodo dragon, the largest lizard on Earth. Their bite is venomous, be careful." I climbed into the truck, and as we drove off I heard CLA's final plea, "Owen, please." I didn't look back. "Remember CLA?" I called. "It's a jungle out there," and we left them behind. 3 days later, Rena and I were back home. It felt strange. We had only been gone a week, but so much had happened. We avoided discussing it, focusing on returning to normal life. Still, I couldn't help but think about what we had done when I was alone. Was it the right choice? I wasn't sure, but I didn't feel guilty. Nephi returned to America soon after. We reassured her that any threats were gone without giving details. She said she liked America and wanted to come back the night before Nephi's flight. I went for a walk while Rena prepared her room. My thoughts drifted to the plan, wondering if Claude, Jasmine, and Armin had survived. We hadn't heard anything about them, but I couldn't stop wondering. Jasmine and Claude, meanwhile, were struggling through the jungle, tired and bitten by insects. They were lost. Armin led the way until suddenly, he screamed and collapsed, bitten by a venomous snake. Realizing there was nothing they could do, Jasmine and Claude left him to die alone. Later, Claude, exhausted and limping from an injury, insisted they rest. They lay on a tarp, but in the middle of the night a creature attacked Claude. It wasn't a snake, it was bigger, exhausted and anxious. They realized they needed to keep moving, but Claude's condition was deteriorating. His foot swelled from the bite, and when they reached a creek, it was clear he couldn't continue. "You go get help," Claude told Jasmine. They both knew what that meant. She turned and left him behind, heading deeper into the jungle. Back home, life was almost back to normal. I was teaching and working on a paper while Rena continued her work at the campus clinic. Nephi had bounced back, though she still had moments when the trauma resurfaced. We reassured her that she was safe. As for Claude, Jasmine, and Armin, we hadn't heard anything. Someone mentioned Papaya had closed, raising more questions, but I knew I couldn't ask too much. Jasmine, exhausted and bitten, finally found a place to rest. She lay down, without checking for snakes, only to be woken by a foul smell before she could react. A Kodo dragon attacked, biting into her leg. Months later, I sat reflecting on how much my life had changed. Rena had convinced me to get a manicure, a far cry from the days when my hands were always dirty from farming. It was hard to believe how much it shifted. 3 months after our Komodo Island trip, I got a call from John Scalia, my divorce attorney. He wanted to meet in person when I arrived. He explained that 60 days ago, the Indonesian Forest Service found 3 bodies on Komodo Island. DNA confirmed 2 were Claude and Jasmine. They had wandered into the jungle and were attacked by Komodo dragons. Their remains were identified with a 998% DNA match, but then Scalia explained why this mattered to me since Jasmine never updated her will. After our divorce, I was the sole heir to Claude's estate. Valued at $28 million, including the restaurant Papaya Typhoon, the new restaurant was thriving under Vi's leadership. As the chef with Nephi running the coffee shop. Nephi now engaged to her childhood friend. EKA was happy and Dennis had remained a friend but had moved on from their relationship. Bhakti had also moved to America and now worked as the maitre d' at Typhoon, bringing his warmth and charm to the restaurant. Sometimes I wondered if what we did was right, but I never felt guilt. My family was happy and, as I left the manicurist that day, I was happy too. My hands were finally clean. I'm going to turn this one over to you. What do you make of this situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and as always, a huge thank you from the bottom of my heart for getting involved in today's stories. Your love, support, and time mean the world to me. So, thank you so much for being part of this. I really appreciate your time. I'll see you in the next one. Take care and much love.